The acrid smell of cordite and machine oil had become Annelise Hartmann's entire world. At 17, she had forgotten what fresh air tasted like, what sunlight felt like on skin not covered in grime and chemical burns. The munitions factory near Aachen stretched before her like a cathedral of iron and suffering, its ceiling lost in shadows and smoke, its floor a maze of conveyor belts that never stopped moving, never allowed rest, never forgave mistakes. The noise was constant and deafening. The clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the grinding of gears, and underneath it all, the muted sounds of human suffering that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had been 14 when they came, the officers in their crisp uniforms, accompanied by local officials with apologetic eyes that refused to meet her mother's gaze. Arbeitspflicht, they called it, labor duty, a service to the fatherland in its hour of desperate need. Her father had already disappeared months earlier, taken in the night after someone reported his loose talk about the war, his dangerous questions about where Jewish neighbors had gone, his failure to display sufficient enthusiasm for the Reich's victories. Her mother had wept silently as Annelise packed the small bag they permitted, knowing protests would only bring more attention, more danger, perhaps even death to them both. Now, 3 years later, Annelise's hands moved with mechanical precision born of endless repetition and fear, assembling detonators for artillery shells that would kill people she would never meet, in battles she would never witness. Around her, dozens of other girls and women performed similar tasks, their faces hollow and gray with exhaustion, their movements automatic from the numbing routine of survival. The factory ran on fear and starvation, and the constant threat of violence. 14-hour shifts melted into 16 when quotas weren't met, and they were never met because the quotas were designed to be impossible. Food came in portions calculated to keep them alive but never satisfied, never strong enough to consider resistance or escape. Sleep was stolen in crowded barracks where crying was done into thin pillows so the guards wouldn't hear and make examples of the weak. The SS guards patrolled with rifles and casual cruelty, their boots echoing on the concrete floors like clockwork reminders of who held absolute power over life and death. Annelise had learned through bitter necessity to make herself invisible, to never draw attention, to work steadily without pause or complaint or any sign of independent thought. She had seen what happened to those who faltered, who questioned, who showed any sign of resistance or weakness or humanity. The empty beds that appeared overnight told their own story, and the official explanation was always the same. Shot while attempting escape, though everyone knew the truth was often simpler and more brutal than that. Sometimes people just disappeared for looking at a guard wrong, for working too slowly, for existing. But something had changed in recent weeks that gave her pause, despite her best efforts to remain numb. The older women whispered when the guards weren't listening, their voices barely audible over the constant roar of machinery that never stopped, never rested. The Americans were coming, they said with cautious excitement. The British too. The Wehrmacht was being pushed back on all fronts. The great machine of the Third Reich was finally grinding to a halt after years of seeming invincibility, they said, though speaking such thoughts aloud meant immediate death. Annelise wanted desperately to believe it, but hope was a dangerous luxury she could no longer afford. Hope hurt too much when it was crushed. She had learned through hard experience to focus only on survival, on the next hour, the next shift, the next day. Tomorrow was too far away to think about. Next week was a fantasy. The end of the war was a dream she didn't dare let herself dream. At night, in her narrow bunk that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair, she would close her eyes and try to remember her mother's face, her father's laugh, the small apartment in Cologne where she had once been a girl with dreams of becoming a teacher, of having a family, of living a normal life filled with simple joys. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who had died long ago in a different world that seemed impossibly distant. The girl who remained was harder, quieter, built from necessity and fear and the grim determination to survive at any cost. She no longer believed in the propaganda, the promises of final victory, the glorious future of a 1,000-year Reich that would rule Europe forever. She believed only in getting through each day alive, and even that belief was tested every morning when she woke to face another day in this manufactured hell. At night, in her narrow bunk, she would close her eyes and try to remember her mother's face, her father's laugh, the small apartment in Cologne where she had once been a girl with dreams of becoming a teacher. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who had died long ago. The girl who remained was harder, quieter, built from necessity and fear. She no longer believed in the propaganda, the promises of final victory, the glorious future of a 1,000-year Reich. She believed only in getting through each day alive. The explosion happened during the night shift, when exhaustion made fingers clumsy and minds slow. Annelise was finishing her quota when the blast tore through Section C, 3 rows from where she stood. The force knocked her to the ground, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Smoke and debris filled the air, turning the factory into a choking fog. Alarms shrieked as workers scrambled away from the flames. Guards rushed in with fire extinguishers, shouting contradictory orders, their carefully maintained discipline fracturing in the face of genuine chaos. It took hours to contain the fire. 2 workers were dead, their bodies burned beyond recognition. 5 more were badly burned, their screams echoing through the night. As dawn broke gray and cold through the factory's high windows, the SS began their investigation. Sabotage, they concluded immediately, without hesitation. Someone had deliberately caused the explosion. Someone had betrayed the Reich. The questioning began that afternoon, methodical and merciless. Annelise knew she was in danger before they called her name. She had been working near Section C. She had access to the materials. And there was something else that made her blood run cold. 3 months ago, she had been overheard asking another worker why they were making weapons to kill people who had done nothing wrong. She had thought the conversation was private, whispered during a brief moment when the guards were distracted. She had been catastrophically wrong. Someone had heard. Someone had reported it, and now they remembered. The interrogation room was small and windowless, lit by a single bare bulb that cast harsh shadows. 2 SS officers sat across from her, their faces set in expressions of practiced intimidation. They asked the same questions over and over, twisted her words, suggested she was part of a resistance cell, implied that confession now would go easier than confession later. When she denied everything, one officer stood and walked slowly around her chair, his boots deliberate on the concrete floor. "We execute saboteurs," he said quietly, almost conversationally, "usually by firing squad, sometimes by hanging. If we want to make an example, which would you prefer?" Annelise's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. Her hands shook in her lap. She repeated her innocence until her voice cracked, until tears streamed down her face, until she thought they would simply shoot her there to end the charade. But they didn't have proof, only suspicion and circumstance. After 6 hours of relentless questioning, they released her back to the factory floor with a warning that chilled her to her bones. "We're watching you now, Hartmann. Every moment, every move. One mistake, and you're finished." The surveillance was constant after that. Guards positioned themselves near her workstation, their eyes never leaving her. Her bunkmates were questioned about her habits, her conversations, her loyalties. She felt the noose tightening with each passing day, knowing that eventually they would manufacture evidence if they couldn't find it, that her life hung by the thinnest thread. She began planning her escape in desperate, fragmentary thoughts, but there was nowhere to go. The factory was surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire. Beyond that, miles of hostile territory. The Allies were coming, but they might be weeks away. She might not have that long. She began planning her escape in desperate, fragmentary thoughts. But escape to where? The factory was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by guard towers and barbed wire. Even if she made it past the perimeter, where would she go? A German girl alone on the roads would be stopped, questioned, returned, or worse. The Allies were coming, the whispers said, but they might be weeks or months away. She might not have that long. The bombardment began without warning on a moonless October night. Annelise was on the late shift when the first shells struck. The whistle of incoming artillery was like the scream of a dying animal, growing louder, unbearable. Then the explosion that shook the ground and made the factory's iron frame groan. Then another, and another. The lights went out. Emergency lamps cast wild shadows as the building trembled with each impact. Workers abandoned their stations, running for the exits in a panicked mass. Guards shouted orders that no one could hear over the thunder of the barrage. Annelise ran with them, driven by pure instinct, her mind blank with terror. A shell hit the roof directly above her. The explosion was deafening, a physical blow that lifted her off her feet and threw her into darkness. When she came to, she couldn't breathe. Dust and smoke choked the air. Something heavy pressed against her legs. She tried to move and pain lanced through her left side. A steel beam had fallen across her, not crushing her but pinning her in place beneath rubble and twisted metal. All around, the factory was collapsing. She could hear screams, the crack of splitting timber, the roar of fires taking hold. She pulled at the beam with desperate strength, but it wouldn't budge. Blood ran warm down her leg from where something sharp had cut her. This is how I die, she thought with strange clarity. Not by execution, but by chance. Crushed in a building I was forced to work in, making weapons for a war I never believed in. The bombardment continued, each impact shaking dust from the ruins around her. She saw workers running past her hiding place, saw a guard stumble by with blood streaming down his face, saw the SS officers who had interrogated her sprinting for safety without a backward glance at the people they had supposedly been guarding. In that moment, something inside her broke and reformed. They had never cared. She had never mattered to them except as a tool, and now that the tool was broken, they simply left it behind. I am begging you, she whispered into the darkness and smoke, not knowing who she was speaking to, some abstract idea of God or fate or mercy. I am begging you. I don't want to die here. Please. Someone. Anyone. The words felt useless, swallowed by the chaos. But she said them anyway, again and again, as if repetition could make them real, could summon help from the impossible void. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on her face. This was the end, she knew. The acceptance of it settled over her like a shroud. She heard them before she saw them. Voices speaking English. Sharp commands in an accent she recognized from propaganda films. Except these voices weren't the demonic growls the newsreels had promised. They sounded human. Young. Tense but controlled. The crunch of boots over debris. The click of weapons being readied. A beam of light swept across the wreckage. Annelise tried to call out, but her voice emerged as a croak. The light moved on, then suddenly swung back, pinning her in its glare. She raised her hand instinctively, shielding her eyes, and began to speak in broken English she barely knew. Don't shoot. Please don't shoot. I am begging you, don't shoot. Figures emerged from the darkness, silhouettes with rifles. She waited for the bullet, tensed against it. But instead, the light lowered slightly, and one of the soldiers stepped closer. He was young, maybe 20, with a dirt-smeared face and eyes that widened as he took in the scene. He turned and called to others. Sergeant, there's a girl here. Civilian, I think. She's trapped. More soldiers appeared. Annelise's mind struggled to process what was happening. These were Americans. The enemy. The monsters from the propaganda. But the young soldier who had found her was lowering his rifle, kneeling beside the rubble, his face creased with concern rather than malice. It's okay, he said in slow, careful English. We're going to help you. My name's Miller. What's yours? Annelise, she managed. Annelise Hartmann. An older soldier approached, stripes on his uniform marking him as a sergeant. He studied her with harder eyes, his rifle still ready. Could be a trap. Germans have used civilians before, but Miller shook his head firmly. Look at her, Sarge. She's a kid. She's hurt and scared. She's not faking this. The sergeant's jaw worked as he made his calculation. Finally, he nodded curtly. Get her out, but watch yourselves. He turned to the rest of the squad. Murphy, Wallace, help Private Miller. The rest of you, secure the perimeter, and keep your heads down. This place could still have holdouts. 3 soldiers worked to free her, lifting the beam with coordinated effort while Miller pulled her clear. The movement sent agony through her injured leg and she bit down on a scream. They laid her on a relatively clear patch of ground, and Miller examined her wounds by flashlight. "Not too bad," he said, though his voice carried doubt. "Cuts deep, but it's not arterial. You'll be okay." Annelise stared up at him, this enemy soldier with gentle hands and worried eyes, and couldn't reconcile him with everything she had been told. He should be cruel. He should be violent. Instead, he was wrapping her leg with a bandage from his pack, his movements efficient and careful. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried to stand and nearly fell. He caught her, supporting her weight. "Okay, we'll carry you." The sergeant returned. "We need to move. Artillery's shifted north, but we're still in range, and I want to be clear of this sector before dawn." He looked at Annelise and his expression softened fractionally. "She comes with us. We'll sort out what to do with her when we're back at the CP." Miller and another soldier, a wiry corporal named Jensen, supported Annelise between them as the squad moved through the ruined factory. Every step sent pain shooting through her leg, but she bit down on it, determined not to slow them down. Around them, fires still burned, casting everything in hellish orange light. The smell of cordite mixed with burning wood, and something worse that she tried not to think about. They emerged into the night air and Annelise gasped at the destruction. The entire industrial complex was devastated, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, craters pocking the ground. In the distance, the flash of artillery continued, a distant thunder that never quite stopped. The Americans moved quickly but carefully, following a route the sergeant seemed to know by instinct, avoiding open ground, using rubble for cover. They had covered maybe half a mile when the sniper fired. The crack of the rifle was sharp and distinct. Jensen grunted and went down, pulling Annelise with him. The squad scattered immediately, returning fire toward a damaged building to their left. Miller dragged both of them behind a collapsed wall, his face tight with fear and adrenaline. Jensen's shoulder was bleeding. He pressed his hand against it and cursed steadily under his breath. "Just a graze," he said through gritted teeth, though Annelise could see it was more than that. Another soldier crawled over and began working on the wound. Miller stayed with Annelise, his rifle trained on the building, his body between her and the threat. The firefight was brief but intense. The sergeant coordinated suppressing fire while 2 men flanked the sniper's position. A grenade blast ended it. In the sudden quiet that followed, Annelise's ears rang. She realized she was shaking uncontrollably. Miller glanced back at her and his expression softened. "First time under fire?" She nodded, unable to speak. "It gets easier," he said. "Not much, but a little." They moved on, now with 2 wounded instead of 1. Jensen insisted he could walk, his arm in an improvised sling. The sergeant picked up the pace, urgency overriding caution. Dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky when they finally reached the American lines, a series of hastily dug foxholes and defensive positions manned by exhausted-looking soldiers who waved them through with minimal challenge. A medic station had been set up in a partially intact building. They laid Jensen on a stretcher and the medics went to work immediately. Another medic approached Annelise and gestured for her to sit. She obeyed numbly, letting him clean and properly dress her wound, while Miller stayed nearby, translating the medic's questions and her halting answers. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on her. She had survived. Against all probability, all expectation, she had survived, and the people who had saved her were the ones she had been taught to fear most. The contrast between the SS guards who had abandoned her and these American soldiers who had risked their lives for her was so stark it felt like a physical thing, reshaping her understanding of the world. Miller sat down beside her as the medic finished. He looked exhausted, his face gray beneath the dirt. "You saved me," Annelise said in careful English. "Thank you." He shrugged uncomfortably. "We save who we can. That's the job." But his eyes, when they met hers, were kind. "You'll be okay now. I promise." The interrogation room was nothing like the SS chamber. A captain named Richardson conducted it, with a younger lieutenant taking notes. Richardson's questions were methodical. Who was she? Where was she from? How long had she worked at the factory? His tone wasn't cruel, but it was deeply suspicious. Annelise answered truthfully, explaining the forced labor, her father's disappearance, the 3 years of suffering. You understand our position, Richardson said. You're a German national found in a munitions factory. Annelise fought back tears. I am 17 years old. I was taken from my home. I make bullets because if I don't, they shoot me. That is the truth. The lieutenant pointed to her scarred, chemical-burned hands. Richardson studied her, then sighed. We'll verify what we can. You'll be under guard. Get some rest. They gave her a small room with a cot. Hours later, Miller appeared with food. He sat on the floor at a respectful distance. Thought you might be hungry. She ate slowly. He asked quietly. How old are you really? 17, she said. He was quiet. My sister's 17. I'm sorry for what you've been through. Why did you help me? She asked. You could have left me. Miller met her eyes steadily. Because you're not the enemy. You're just a kid caught in something bigger than all of us. Leaving you would have made me into something I don't want to be. He smiled faintly. Besides, you asked nicely. Part 7. The Weight of the Past. Over the next days, Annelise told Miller her story in fragments. He would bring food and talk quietly. She told him about her father, a school teacher who questioned why Jewish families were disappearing, about the night men took him away while she hid in a closet. They never learned what happened to him. She told him about her mother, who died when a British bomb hit their building. She told him about the propaganda films showing Americans as savage brutes, and how she had believed it because what else could she believe? The dissonance of sitting here, safe and treated with kindness, was almost more than she could process. I thought you would kill me, she admitted. Miller looked down. I thought we might have to leave you. Sarge almost ordered it. Taking you was against protocol. He met her eyes. But I couldn't. On the 3rd day, he brought news. Richardson's cleared you. You're officially designated as a forced laborer. Relief flooded through her. What happens now? Miller explained her options. Displaced persons camps, attempts to locate family, or staying in the region. And you? She asked. Wherever they send us. East, probably. He smiled. You're safe now. I swear. Whatever happens next, you're going to be okay. That night, Annelise cried for the first time since the factory, releasing 3 years of tension, grieving for what was lost, but also feeling something that felt almost like hope. The counterattack came at dawn. Explosions and rifle fire shook the building. Miller burst through her door. German counterattack. We're pulling back. He grabbed her arm. Come on, we need to get you to the rear. The basement had been converted into a shelter. Miller pressed her behind supply crates. Stay here. Don't move unless the building's coming down. He was gone, running toward battle. The bombardment intensified. More wounded arrived. A massive explosion shook the building, collapsing part of the ceiling. Someone shouted to evacuate. Then Miller returned, his face blackened with powder burns. We're holding them. Stay down. She caught his sleeve. Don't go back up there. He smiled without humor. I have to, but I'll be back. The battle raged for 2 hours before the Germans withdrew. As soldiers emerged, Annelise searched frantically until she found Miller alive, exhausted, leaning against a wall. Their eyes met and he nodded once. We made it. Both of us. Part 9. The Choice of Freedom. Days later, Captain Richardson summoned her. We're consolidating control. You have options. A displaced persons camp, attempts to locate family, or staying here. He paused. We also need interpreters. People who speak German and English. If you wanted to help with the civil affairs unit, we could arrange it. She stared at him. Work for you? The idea seemed impossible. My English is not very good. Richardson leaned forward. It's good enough. You've survived something most can't imagine. We need people who understand life under the Reich. Think about it. That evening, she walked through the captured sector. The factory was a blackened ruin in the distance. She thought about the girl who had worked there, who had given up hope. That girl had died in the rubble. Someone new had emerged. Miller found her at the factory gate. Thinking about going back? Never, she said fiercely. Richardson offered me work, as an interpreter. You should take it, Miller said. You'd be good at it. And it'd mean you'd be around for a while. I'd like that. Warmth spread through her chest. Hope, possibility, a future beyond survival. I choose freedom, she said quietly. However that looks, I choose to be free. They stood together in the dusk, connected by a moment of decency when it mattered most. 4 months later, the war in Europe ended. Annelise heard the news while working in the civil affairs office in Aachen, helping coordinate relief efforts. Around her, people wept with relief and embraced. The city was still largely in ruins, but there were signs of life returning. Shops reopening, families reuniting, children playing in streets that had been battlegrounds weeks before. The long nightmare was finally over. She had grown into her role as interpreter with surprising ease. Her English improved rapidly through constant use, and her understanding of what people had endured made her uniquely valuable in identifying those who needed help versus those who had been complicit and now sought to hide their past. Captain Richardson had been right. She was stronger than she had known. The work was hard, often devastating, but meaningful. She was helping people. She was making a real difference. She lived in a small apartment in a partially restored building, sharing it with 2 other young women who had survived similar ordeals. They cooked together in the evenings, pooling rations and whatever fresh vegetables they could trade for, talking about the future with cautious optimism. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She chose when to wake up, what to wear, where to go. Every small freedom felt like a profound victory. Miller had been transferred east during the winter push, but they exchanged letters that became bright spots in difficult weeks. His were full of observations about places he'd seen, questions about her well-being, carefully worded wishes that the war would end soon. Her responses were reserved at first, but gradually became more honest. She told him about her work, her apartment, her tentative plans to perhaps become a teacher like her father had been. In May, a month after Germany's surrender, he returned to Aachen as part of the occupation force. Annelise was transcribing documents when someone knocked. She looked up, and there he was, thinner, with new lines around his eyes, but smiling that same genuine smile. "Hello, Annelise," he said. "I told you I'd come back." They walked through the rebuilding city as afternoon sun painted everything gold, talking easily now. Miller told her about the concentration camps they had liberated, about evidence of systematic atrocities that had shaken even hardened soldiers. Annelise told him about survivors she had helped reunite with family, about children she had placed in homes, about small victories that kept her going through difficult work. Eventually, their steps led them to the factory ruins. It had been partially demolished for safety, but the shell still stood like a skeleton against the darkening sky. They stood at the gate where she had been trapped, where he had found her begging not to be shot, where everything had changed. "You saved me when my own country left me to die," Annelise said quietly. "I will never forget that. When I had given up all hope, you chose to help me anyway." She pulled out a small wildflower she had picked, one of the few blooms pushing up through rubble. She walked to where she remembered being trapped and laid it carefully on the broken ground, a memorial to the girl who had died there and the woman born from her ashes. "What's that for?" Miller asked gently. "For the girl who died here," Annelise said, turning to face him. "The one who thought she had no future, no hope, no choice. She's gone now. Someone else lives in her place." She managed a small smile. "Someone who understands that enemies are just people who haven't met yet. That kindness matters more than orders. That freedom is something you choose every day. That we're all responsible for the world we help create." Miller stood beside her, looking at the small flower standing defiant against devastation. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't come through that night? If we'd taken a different route? Or if Sarge had decided to leave you? Annelise shook her head firmly. I try not to dwell on those thoughts. What matters is what did happen. You came. You helped. You gave me a second chance at life. She took his hand. And I'm trying to live in a way that honors that gift. They stood together as the sun set over Aachen, casting long shadows across a city learning to rebuild from ashes. The war was over. The occupation would eventually end. Miller would go home to America someday. Annelise would remain to help reconstruct the country that had tried to destroy her. But in that moment, on that scarred ground where her life had almost ended and instead been transformed, they were simply two people who had found humanity in the midst of inhumanity, who had chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier. Thank you, Annelise said, one more time, for everything. Miller smiled and shook his head. You saved yourself, Annelise. You chose to survive when survival seemed impossible. You chose to hope when hope seemed foolish. You chose to rebuild when destruction would have been easier. I just helped clear a path through the rubble. Everything after that was you. They walked away from the ruins together, their footsteps echoing in twilight, leaving the small flower to stand witness to what had been lost and found, to what had died and been born. Behind them, the factory crumbled slowly back into the earth. Ahead, the city waited, broken but breathing, wounded but healing, ready to be remade by people who remembered what it meant to choose compassion over cruelty, who understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains but the presence of choice, who knew that the best memorial to those who suffered was to build a world where such suffering could never happen again.